Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, if you think you know the men who sat behind the Resolute desk, get ready, because we're about to completely rewrite your history books. We are stripping away all that solemn Oval Office formality to reveal the absolute most bizarre, mind-blowing, and honestly deeply human facts about every single U.S. president. Let's just dive right in by tossing out the grand illusions we usually associate with the presidency. We tend to picture these leaders as stoic figures carved in marble, delivering perfectly rehearsed speeches, right? Well, the reality is completely unhinged. As you'll see, we are talking about heads of state who engaged in daily skinny dipping, handed out actual wrestling beatdowns, chased UFOs, and apparently possessed cat-like reflexes for dodging flying footwear. So, let's kick things off with Act 1. Brawlers, athletes, and tough guys. 299. That is not a typo. That massive number represents Abraham Lincoln's freakish athleticism. Way before he was the great emancipator, a 22-year-old 6'4" Lincoln was a frontier wrestling champion who won literally 299 out of his 300 matches. In his most famous bout, he got into a gritty back and forth before just body slamming a local gang leader named Jack Armstrong straight into the dirt, earning his absolute respect. Seriously, Lincoln is actually in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And that physical grit definitely defined other administrations too. Take Andrew Jackson. He was involved in over 100 duels. In one of them, he literally stood there bleeding out after taking a bullet to the chest, calmly leveled his own pistol, and killed the man who had insulted his wife. Then there's Teddy Roosevelt, who shrugged off an assassination attempt where a bullet tore through his coat, his eyeglass case, and a thick 50-page speech. With the bullet lodged near his rib, he actually stood up and delivered an 84-minute speech before finally going to the doctor. We've also got Ronald Reagan, who used to carve notches into a wooden log for the 77 lives he personally saved as a lifeguard. Oh, and Grover Cleveland. As a sheriff, he actually pulled the lever on the gallows himself because he wanted to spare his deputies the guilt. Now, the physical action certainly didn't stop in the modern era. George H.W. Bush celebrated his 75th, 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays by casually jumping out of airplanes, famously saying that you don't have to just sit around when you get old. His son George W. Bush showed off some pretty incredible reaction time, dodging 2 size 10 shoes hurled at him by a journalist during a press conference. Barack Obama literally turned the White House tennis court into a basketball court, running intense pickup games against actual NBA legends like LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. And Donald Trump? He stands entirely alone as the only president enshrined in the WWE Hall of Fame, after famously tackling Vince McMahon and shaving his head clean in front of a roaring crowd at WrestleMania 23. Moving right along to Act 2, Bizarre Habits and Eccentricities. When it comes to personal boundaries, some of these presidents had absolutely zero. John Quincy Adams, for instance, took a nude swim in the Potomac River every single morning. A reporter named Anne Royale actually sat on his clothes until he agreed to an interview from the water. Talk about a transparent administration. Then there's LBJ, who would casually hold meetings while sitting on the toilet with the door wide open, and was known to just relieve himself outdoors in front of his staff and the Secret Service. But then you contrast that extreme oversharing with Herbert Hoover, who was so intensely private that he had an elaborate bell system installed in the White House. Whenever it rang, his staff had to physically flatten themselves against walls or dive into closets just so he wouldn't have to look at them. Their fashion priorities were also wildly different. They sat at 2 completely opposite ends of the spectrum. Chester Arthur was obsessed with luxury. The man owned over 80 pairs of pants, changed clothes multiple times a day, and took these late-night strolls just to window shop for silk ties. Reporters literally joked he'd rather lose a vote than a good tailor. On the total flip side, we have Andrew Johnson. He was a former tailor who quite literally cut and hand-stitched his own inaugural suit to wear when he was sworn into the highest office in the land. And if you thought their personal habits were wild, look at their pets. The White House was basically a circus. John Adams had a dog with the most diabolical name imaginable, Satan. William Henry Harrison let a super-aggressive goat roam the grounds that would actively headbutt his cabinet members. Zachary Taylor brought his beloved warhorse, Old Whitey, to the lawn, but the poor thing went completely bald because visitors kept plucking hairs from his tail as souvenirs. And my favorite, Calvin Coolidge, was actually sent a live raccoon to eat for Thanksgiving, but instead he pardoned her, named her Rebecca, and the First Lady used to walk her around the grounds on a little leash. We also see these incredible contrasts when it comes to the presidential mind. James Garfield might have been our smartest president. He was an ambidextrous genius who could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the exact same time, and he even published an original mathematical proof. Now compare that raw intellect with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The man who guided America through the Great Depression and World War II suffered from crippling triskaidekaphobia. That is an intense fear of the number 13. He completely refused to travel on the 13th of any month or sit at a dinner table with 13 guests. And speaking of ironies, Dwight D. Eisenhower grew up in a deeply religious pacifist household that strictly opposed violence, yet he evolved into the legendary general who led the invasion of Normandy and defeated Nazi Germany. All right, let's get into Act 3, Mishaps, Anomalies, and Mysteries. It is time to bust some major historical myths that we have all been taught. For starters, George Washington did not have wooden teeth. His mouth was actually filled with a tortuous contraption made of human teeth, cow teeth, hippopotamus ivory, and these metal springs that creaked and caused his jaw to bulge. Yikes. Also, William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. He simply had a custom extra-large tub installed that was big enough to comfortably fit 4 grown men just to accommodate his 340-pound frame. And Millard Fillmore, he never installed the first White House bathtub. That's a total fabrication. However, he did personally help form a bucket brigade to save books when the Library of Congress caught on fire, so he still gets some hero points there. Speaking of historical anomalies, check out the biological time machine that is John Tyler. Our 10th president was born in 1790, which is literally during the era of George Washington. He fathered 15 children, the most of any president, and had his absolute last child at the age of 70. Because of this massive generational gap, Tyler's direct living grandson survived all the way into the iPhone era, passing away in the year 2020. Seriously, a single family tree spanned from the founding fathers directly to the modern digital age. And the 19th century in general was just full of bizarre vehicular and tech firsts. Franklin Pierce was allegedly the only sitting president arrested after running over an elderly woman with his carriage, though missing records suggest the government might have swept his reckless carriaging under the rug. Ulysses S. Grant, however, definitely got pulled over. He had a serious need for equestrian speed and actually received 3 speeding tickets from a DC police officer just for racing his horse through the streets. Then there's Rutherford B. Hayes, who was given the very first telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. His phone number was literally just the number 1. His review of the tech? He called it a great invention, but wondered who would ever actually use it. Then you've got these wildly strange personal distinctions. James Madison, the brilliant chief architect of the Constitution, was our smallest president. He stood at just 5'4" and barely cracked 100 pounds. Martin Van Buren's nickname, Old Kinderhook, gave the world the rally cry, "Vote for OK," which accidentally helped cement the most popular 2-letter word in global history. James K. Polk worked insane 16-hour days and completely exhausted himself, giving him the shortest presidential retirement ever. He sadly died just 103 days after leaving office. Oh, and Harry Truman's middle initial, the letter S, it stands for absolutely nothing. It was literally just a typo of a compromise between his 2 grandfathers' names. But what's fascinating is how these personal quirks often bled right into executive choices during really high-stakes moments. Benjamin Harrison just recycled the 48-year-old White House china from his grandfather, William Henry Harrison. Meanwhile, Warren G. Harding casually gambled away priceless White House china dating all the way back to James Madison in a raucous game of poker. William McKinley faithfully wore a red carnation every day for good luck, but the exact moment he took it off to hand it to a little girl in a crowd, he was tragically assassinated. And perhaps the highest stakes of all, when Woodrow Wilson was paralyzed by a stroke, his wife, Edith Wilson, quietly screened all his visitors, controlled all his paperwork, and effectively ran the entire executive branch in secret for 17 whole months. Finally, we reach Act 4, Secrets, Scandals, and Humanity. Behind those dignified doors of the Oval Office lies a really complex web of personal scandals and secrets. Modern DNA testing proves Thomas Jefferson fathered children with his enslaved servant Sally Hemings, who, by the way, was his late wife's half-sister, and he kept his own children enslaved after they were born. James Buchanan, our only officially unmarried president, left behind private letters referring to Senator William King as his better half and his wife, fueling centuries of speculation about his personal life. In the modern era, JFK's highly publicized and pretty reckless affairs involved an East German spy, a 19-year-old intern, and of course, Marilyn Monroe. And we all know Bill Clinton famously and vehemently denied his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky before the truth finally came to light. But alongside the heavy stuff, there are moments that are just delightfully absurd. James Monroe is the only president with a foreign capital named after him, Monrovia, over in Liberia, Africa. Jimmy Carter saw a strange green light in the sky back in 1969 and actually went out of his way to file an official UFO sighting report. Richard Nixon had a private one-lane bowling alley installed under the White House where he'd sneak down late at night to bowl, fully dressed in a formal suit no less. And George H.W. Bush caused a massive international incident at a state dinner when he vomited on the Japanese prime minister. It was such a big deal, it sparked a brand new Japanese slang term, busharoo, which literally translates to do the Bush thing. Now, the ultimate constitutional anomaly has to go to Gerald Ford. He is the only person in U.S. history to serve as both vice president and president without ever actually being elected to either office. Here's how it happened. When Spiro Agnew resigned, Nixon appointed Ford as VP. Then, when the Watergate scandal totally decimated the Nixon administration and forced his resignation, Ford simply moved up the ladder again. He reached the most powerful seat in the free world entirely unelected, completely by just being in the right place at the right time. And wrapping up our chronological cast of characters, we look at the immense resilience of Joe Biden. His 50-year political career started under unimaginably tragic circumstances. Just after winning his very first Senate race, his wife and daughter were killed in a car accident. He was actually sworn into the Senate from his son's hospital room. Decades later, navigating through immense personal grief and major political shifts, he achieved this ultimate comeback arc to finally reach the Oval Office. So after peeling back the dignified curtain to reveal these deeply weird, physically imposing, flawed, and absolutely fascinating figures, we are left with a totally new perspective on leadership. The men in our history books were just as human, just as chaotic, and just as eccentric as the rest of us. So the question remains, which of these bizarre, humanizing presidential quirks completely changes how you see American history? Think about it, because the truth is almost always stranger and way more interesting than the fiction. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.